They said my dog was too large for community standards. I thought it was a bad joke, until the HOA gave me 30 days to get rid of him, or lose my home. Let me start from beginning. When I first moved into Maplewood Estates, it felt like the kind of neighborhood people wrote postcards about. Perfect lawns, quiet mornings, neighbors who waved at you from identical driveways. The kind of place that promised stability, a clean slate. After years of apartment noise and landlord rules, owning my own house was freedom. Or at least, that's what I thought. My dog, Buddy, was part of that dream. A rescued golden retriever mix. 80 pounds of sunshine, fur, and loyalty. He was calm, well-trained, and friendlier than most people I knew. Every morning, we'd walk the trail behind my home, the one lined with maple trees that gave the subdivision its name. He'd sniff the air, tail wagging, and I'd think, this is finally it. Peace. But peace doesn't last long in communities with too much money and too little purpose. The Homeowners Association was supposed to keep things orderly. Trimmed hedges, approved paint colors. No Christmas lights past January 5th. At first, I didn't think much of it, until a letter appeared in my mailbox one afternoon. Notice of violation. Pet size restriction. The words felt absurd. I actually laughed. But when I read the fine print, the laughter stopped. According to some obscure rule buried in the HOA handbook, no dogs exceeding 35 pounds are permitted within the community. 35 pounds. Buddy weighed 80. I thought there must be a mistake. The realtor never mentioned this. I'd seen other neighbors walking large dogs before. But when I asked around, the truth became clear. The HOA had recently revised the rule after a new board president took over. Her name was Carolyn Whitmore. Carolyn was one of those people who made you feel judged just by standing near her. Perfectly pressed outfits, a smile too tight to be friendly, and that HOA clipboard glued to her hand like it was part of her anatomy. She ran the neighborhood like it was a gated kingdom. And apparently, she had decided Buddy was a threat to the aesthetic of Maplewood Estates. Over the next week, the letters escalated. A final warning. Then, a notice of penalty. The HOA threatened daily fines, escalating fees, and even potential legal action if I didn't remove the non-compliant animal from my property. I tried reasoning, politely worded emails, photos of Buddy sitting harmlessly by the porch. I pointed out the other large dogs in the neighborhood, but every reply came stamped with the same signature. Carolyn Whitmore, HOA President. Rules exist for a reason. That phrase would haunt me for months. Soon, neighbors started to distance themselves. Some whispered sympathy. Others avoided eye contact. I'd catch Carolyn walking past my home slowly, jotting notes on her clipboard like a park ranger documenting a dangerous animal. Then came the community meeting. I showed up with Buddy's adoption papers, proof of vaccinations, letters from trainers saying he was harmless. Carolyn sat at the front table like a judge presiding over trial. When she read the pet policy aloud, her voice was sharp enough to cut glass. And when I tried to explain my side, she didn't even look up. She just said, "The board has made its decision. You have 30 days. 30 days to give up the only creature that had been there for me through everything. My move, my divorce, my whole attempt at starting over." I walked home that night with a numb kind of anger. Not fiery rage. Something colder, heavier. The kind that settles in your stomach and starts to grow. I decided then that I wouldn't back down. At first, I tried to fight by the book. I researched the HOA bylaws, looked for contradictions, attended every meeting. But Carolyn and her board had the system locked down. They'd rewritten rules to their advantage, controlling everything from lawn height to mailbox paint colors. They used community standards as a weapon. Every time I raised a point, they dismissed it with that same phrase. Rules exist for a reason. The fines started piling up, $50, then $200, then over $1,000. I paid none of it. Instead, I started keeping records, screenshots, emails, copies of every absurd violation notice. It wasn't just about Buddy anymore. It was about how they treated everyone who dared question them. I began talking to other homeowners quietly, during morning walks and trash pickup days. At first, people were cautious. No one wanted to be seen criticizing the board. But as stories trickled out, a family fined for using unapproved mulch, an elderly couple threatened over a slightly faded fence color, I realized I wasn't alone. There was resentment simmering under the perfect lawns of Maplewood Estates. Carolyn ruled with fear disguised as community pride, and fear only works until someone decides not to play along. One night, I sat on my porch with Buddy beside me, scrolling through the HOA's election procedures. The board positions rotated every year. Nominations were open in a month. That was the moment the plan started to take shape. If Carolyn wanted to hide behind the rules, fine. I'd play by them too. Only this time, I'd play to win. For the next month, I became someone else entirely. The quiet homeowner turned organizer. I went door to door, talking to neighbors not as victims, but as voters. I listened more than I spoke. People wanted change. They just didn't believe it was possible. I showed them it was. By election day, my name was on the ballot for HOA president. Carolyn clearly thought it was a joke. She smirked through the announcement, convinced the vote would be a formality. But when the final tally came in, the room went silent. I won. Carolyn's face, that perfect mask of composure, cracked for the first time. The same rulebook she'd used to control everyone had just handed me the gavel. And as I stood there, with Buddy's leash wrapped around my hand and the neighbors cheering, I made myself one quiet promise. If she wanted to live by the rules, then we were all going to live by them. Every single one. Because the only thing more powerful than breaking the rules was enforcing them exactly as written. And I knew exactly where to start. Becoming HOA president didn't feel real at first. Maybe it was the stunned silence of the election meeting, or the way Carolyn gathered her papers and left without a word. Maybe it was the subtle glances from neighbors, a mixture of disbelief and hope. But the next morning, when I unlocked the HOA office for the first time, it hit me. That small beige building tucked between the tennis courts and the community pool wasn't just an office. It was a fortress of bureaucracy. Inside were filing cabinets full of rules, complaints, and fines, years of micromanagement disguised as community organization. And somewhere in that mess were the same policies that had nearly cost me my home. I wasn't there for revenge. Not yet. At least, that's what I told myself. At first, I just wanted to fix things, to undo the nonsense that had taken over Maplewood Estates, to make it a place where people didn't dread checking their mailbox. But power is a strange thing. Once you realize how much of it was being misused, it changes you. I started by digging through the old records. Carolyn had documented everything: pages of complaints about mailbox colors, unsanctioned lawn ornaments, unapproved vehicles parked an inch too far from curbs. There was even a section labeled Canine Activity Reports. My name appeared 14 times. Reading those reports was surreal, each one framed as a potential threat to community standards. Carolyn had even described Buddy's bark as intimidating to residents. I pictured her typing that from behind her perfectly manicured hedges, clutching her clipboard like a badge of honor. The deeper I looked, the more I saw the pattern. She hadn't been enforcing order. She'd been enforcing control. Selective enforcement, favoritism, and a steady stream of fines that conveniently padded the HOA's budget. And the most telling detail of all, the board members under her weren't villains. They were tired, uninvolved, and intimidated. People who voted yes just to avoid confrontation. That was how Carolyn had reigned for years, through apathy and fear. So I started differently. I didn't lead from the front. I led from the shadows. My first move was simple: transparency. I posted every budget line, every fee, every bylaw amendment online. For the first time in the HOA's history, residents could see where their money went and where it didn't. Within a week, I had more neighbors attending meetings than ever before. People who'd been quiet for years finally started speaking. Some were angry, others relieved. Then came the real fun. Remember that 35-pound dog rule? The one that started everything? I didn't remove it, not yet. Instead, I highlighted it. I printed it on flyers, placed it in mailboxes, even posted it on the HOA website under Community Standards Review. I wanted people to see the absurdity of it, to feel it firsthand. And then, almost poetically, karma delivered my opportunity. 2 weeks into my presidency, I got a complaint. Not about me this time, but from a homeowner on Birch Lane. She said her neighbor's dog had been barking nonstop and scaring her kids. When I checked the address, my heart skipped. The dog belonged to Carolyn Whitmore, a German shepherd named Bentley, easily 80 pounds. The same Carolyn who had fined me over Buddy's size had been violating her own rule the entire time. I verified it twice, checked the HOA records, even found photos of her walking Bentley proudly through the neighborhood newsletter archives. And that was when the moral lines I'd tried to keep began to blur. I called a board meeting. I didn't need to persuade anyone. The new members, a few who'd quietly supported me, a few who just wanted a fresh start, were happy to enforce fairness. So we issued the letter. Notice of violation, pet size restriction. The exact wording she had once sent me. Same formatting, same tone, even the same deadline. 30 days to comply. I wasn't expecting her to comply, of course. That wasn't the point. When the letter arrived, the community chat board exploded. Whispers turned into laughter. Laughter turned into applause. The same neighbors who once feared her now saw the mighty Carolyn receiving her own medicine, doled out word for word. For the first time, people weren't afraid of the HOA. They were amused by it. And it worked. Within days, residents began reporting every absurd violation they could find. But this time, they were mocking the rules, not fearing them. Too many wind chimes? Reported. A lawn gnome 1 inch too tall? Reported. The entire rulebook had become a parody of itself. What once was Carolyn's weapon had become my stage. I hadn't planned on enjoying it so much, But I was still careful. I didn't break the rules. I enforced them with surgical precision. Every notice, every fine, every reminder was technically correct. When Carolyn tried to fight back, citing selective enforcement, I simply showed the documentation she'd created herself. Every precedent, every clause, every memo she'd once written came back to haunt her. She'd built the cage. I just locked the door. Then came the Rule Review Committee, something I introduced under the guise of community involvement. It was, in truth, a way to let residents vent their frustration publicly while ensuring the most ridiculous policies were aired out in full view. People submitted everything, from no car washing in driveways to mailbox color code violations. I didn't reject any of them. I read them aloud, one by one, at open meetings. And with each rule, I'd pause, lean back, and ask one question. Does this really make our community better? The effect was remarkable. Residents began to see what had been hiding in plain sight, that half the rules were rooted not in safety or order, but in someone's personal preferences. By the third meeting, the crowd was openly laughing at the absurdity of it all. That laughter was power. Of course, Carolyn didn't take it well. She started rallying her old allies, claiming I was destroying the integrity of the neighborhood. She filed appeals, petitions, even hinted at legal action. But her influence had evaporated. And when her 30-day deadline expired without compliance, the HOA, now acting entirely by the book, issued fines, $50, then $100, then $200 per day, the same escalating structure she'd invented. She tried ignoring them. Then she tried appealing. Then, finally, she tried pleading, not to me, but to the board. But by then, the board didn't answer to her anymore. The rules existed for a reason, after all. Meanwhile, Buddy became something of a local celebrity. Neighbors would bring him treats during walks. Kids would stop to pet him. The once hostile community had turned into something friendlier, lighter. Even the lawns looked less perfect, and somehow that made everything feel more human. I told myself the balance had been restored, but deep down I knew this wasn't balance. It was retribution. And retribution, once started, is hard to stop. One morning, about 2 months after the election, I received an envelope, this time addressed to me, not from Carolyn, from the county courthouse. It was notice of an upcoming hearing. Carolyn was contesting the fines, claiming malicious enforcement and targeted harassment. She wanted the HOA board investigated. Part of me panicked. Another part of me smiled, because what she didn't realize was that by filing the complaint, she'd triggered an audit, a full financial review of her entire tenure as president. The same audit she'd avoided for years. And when that report came back, it was worse than I expected. There were discrepancies, unauthorized spending, personal expenses listed under community maintenance, dozens of missing receipts, all linked to her name. It wasn't criminal, not yet, but it was damning. Enough to strip her of voting rights and disqualify her from holding any HOA position again. I didn't even have to lift a finger. The rules she had built had turned on her completely. When the board announced the audit results at the next meeting, the room was packed. Carolyn sat in the back, arms folded, her once impeccable composure replaced with quiet fury. The same people who'd once applauded her strictness now stared at her with disappointment. When the decision was read, permanent removal from the board eligibility, she stood up and walked out. No words, no defense, just silence. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. After that, things in Maplewood Estates changed. The HOA softened. We reduced fines, revised rules, and even threw a community barbecue, something Carolyn had banned for potential noise complaints. People smiled again. They waved at each other. The neighborhood that once felt like a prison had become a community. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd gone too far, because every victory came with the same thrill, the same quiet rush that came from turning the system against itself. And once you taste that kind of power, it's hard to let it go. Then came the final twist, the one I didn't see coming. It started with a phone call from the HOA's attorney. He wanted to discuss a pending property issue. Apparently, Carolyn had fallen behind on her dues, thousands of dollars in unpaid fines and fees. Enough that the HOA technically had the right to place a lien on her home, the same threat she'd once used against me. I asked the attorney to confirm. He did. Legally, the HOA could foreclose if the balance remained unpaid for 60 days. I remember hanging up the phone and staring at the wall for a long time. This was it. The end game. I could do to her exactly what she'd tried to do to me. And no one could stop me. Not even her. All I had to do was sign the paperwork. That night, I walked Buddy along the same trail we'd always taken. The air was cool, quiet, peaceful again. For the first time in a long while, I thought about what all of this had cost. Not money, not time, but something heavier. A part of myself I hadn't realized was changing. Maybe revenge had been justified. Maybe it had even been necessary. But I couldn't help wondering if I'd just become the thing I once despised. Still, when I got home and saw that final stack of unpaid fines sitting on my desk, I knew what was coming next. Because the rules still existed, and rules exist for a reason. The lien paperwork sat on my desk for 3 days before I touched it. It was thin, just a few sheets of legal language, but it carried the weight of every sleepless night, every letter, every humiliation I'd endured under Carolyn's rule. The HOA attorney had made it clear. The process was perfectly legal. Carolyn had racked up over $12,000 in unpaid fines and fees, mostly from her own pet size violations and a handful of infractions she'd stubbornly refused to acknowledge. Technically, the HOA wasn't obligated to act. We could let it slide, let her sell her home, or let her make partial payments. But technically wasn't how Carolyn had ever operated. She'd always insisted that rules were absolute, that they existed to protect community standards. And now, I was the one holding the pen that could decide just how absolute they really were. The neighborhood had quieted down since she disappeared from public view. No more complaint letters, no more confrontations. The air felt lighter, but also emptier. It's strange, the silence that comes after conflict. For a while, you think it's peace. Then you realize it's just the absence of noise, waiting for something new to fill it. I'd spend mornings walking Buddy through streets that no longer felt hostile. The same people who used to avoid me now waved, smiling. They'd stop to ask how things were going with the old board, or thank me for saving the neighborhood. To them, it was a victory story, a neat little moral about standing up to corruption and winning. But inside, it didn't feel like winning anymore, because victory had come too easily. and part of me wondered if maybe Carolyn's silence wasn't surrender, but strategy. Then, one morning, I found out I was right. An envelope appeared in my mailbox, hand-delivered, no postage. My name written in tight cursive on the front. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No letterhead, no signature, just a short, precise message. Remember, rules can always be rewritten. That was it. No name, but I didn't need one. Carolyn was still out there, and somehow she wanted me to know it. That afternoon, I drove past her house for the first time since she'd been removed. The yard, once immaculate, had grown wild. The shutters were closed. The same perfect hedges that once framed her porch now looked brittle and gray. I almost turned around, but curiosity got the better of me. There, taped to the front door, was a notice of default. Apparently, she hadn't been bluffing. The fines weren't just unpaid. The bank was now involved. Between missed HOA dues and mortgage arrears, her ownership was slipping fast. It was eerie seeing the symbol of her power, that pristine colonial-style house, now marked for repossession. And I realized, with a strange mix of satisfaction and dread, that I could end it all with one final vote. The next board meeting was small. A few regulars, a few new faces. I went through the usual motions: budget updates, landscaping approvals, upcoming community events. Then, near the end, the attorney cleared his throat. Next item on the agenda, he said, foreclosure authorization for Lot 24, Ms. Whitmore's property. The words hung in the air like a storm cloud. The board looked at me, waiting. It was my call. I tried to focus on the facts. The debts were real. The violations were documented. Every procedural step had been followed. This wasn't personal, but of course it was. I could almost hear her voice from months ago. You have 30 days. I thought about all those letters, the threats, the cold efficiency with which she'd tried to force me to choose between my home and my dog. And for a moment, just one moment, I saw her face again. The confident smirk, the clipboard, the power she thought she'd never lose. Then I pictured Buddy sitting beside me, his tail thumping against the floor, completely unaware of the storm that had brought us here. I looked at the attorney, then I nodded. Proceed. The gavel hit the table. It was done. Word spread fast. Within days, everyone in Maplewood Estates knew. The former queen of the HOA was losing her castle. Some called it justice. Others called it karma. A few said nothing, just smiled in that knowing way people do when they're relieved it's not their turn. And for a brief, hollow moment, I thought I'd feel triumphant. But instead, I felt nothing. The silence afterward was louder than the decision itself. I went home, sat on the porch, and watched the sunset bleed through the maple trees. Buddy rested his head on my knee, eyes half closed. I could feel his warmth, steady and grounding. He didn't know about rules or revenge or HOA bylaws. He just knew we were home. And somehow, that made everything else feel smaller. 2 weeks later, I received another envelope. This one official. It confirmed the foreclosure sale date. I didn't even open it. I knew what it meant. The same system Carolyn had once used to terrify homeowners was now carrying her out of her own house. But here's the thing about rules. Once they start rolling downhill, they don't stop just because they hit their target. They keep moving. And before long, they hit everyone else. It started small. A few new complaints from residents. Things I thought we'd moved past. A fence an inch too high. A shed slightly off color. a driveway not pressure washed. At first, I ignored them. But the bylaws didn't. They were still there, still active. And because I'd insisted on strict enforcement to trap Carolyn, those same rules now applied equally to everyone, including my supporters. Suddenly, neighbors who'd once thanked me were now frustrated. They wanted flexibility, leniency, exceptions. But fairness, once weaponized, can't be undone. I'd built a system of mirrors, and now every reflection showed me the same thing. Carolyn's methods, wearing my face, I tried to fix it. I called emergency meetings, proposed amendments, tried to roll back the excess rules. But bureaucracy moves slowly, painfully slowly. The same tangled web that had once trapped me was now trapping everyone. And the irony was, no one to blame but me, because I hadn't destroyed Carolyn's system. I'd just replaced the name at the top. The foreclosure went through on a gray Thursday morning. I didn't go, but I heard about it from a neighbor who couldn't resist watching. Carolyn didn't fight. She just handed over the keys and left. No one knew where she went. Some said she moved in with family. Others whispered she'd filed complaints against the HOA at the county level. But I never saw her again. What I did see, weeks later, was a for sale sign hammered into her front yard. The same spot where she once measured other people's grass lengths with a ruler. A few days after that, a moving truck pulled up, and the new owners arrived. A young couple with 2 little kids and a dog, a big one, 80, maybe 90 pounds. I stood on the sidewalk and watched as the kids laughed and the dog bounded across the lawn, tail wagging, free and happy. For a second, I almost went over to welcome them, to tell them they had nothing to fear. But then I remembered, the rule still existed. I hadn't repealed it yet. That night, I sat at my desk again, staring at the same rule book that had started everything. The pet size restriction. It was still there, printed in black ink, page 42. The symbol of everything that had poisoned Maplewood Estates from the start. I opened my laptop, logged into the HOA portal, and began drafting an amendment. Effective immediately, the Homeowners Association of Maplewood Estates removes all restrictions on household pet size. I read it twice, then 3 times. But before I could finalize it, I noticed the small print at the bottom of the screen. Changes require majority board approval. And that's when I realized the same board that once followed me blindly no longer existed. Members had resigned. Others had grown wary. The remaining few wanted a return to structure. I couldn't pass anything without them. Not even this. The machine I'd built to take down Carolyn was now out of my control. Weeks turned into months. The community shifted again, not back to what it was before, but into something stranger. A kind of quiet compliance. No one challenged the HOA anymore, but no one trusted it either. The laughter that once filled meetings was gone. People attended out of obligation, not interest. The barbecue we'd started the year before was canceled for budgetary reasons, and every so often I'd catch someone looking at me the way I used to look at Carolyn, cautious, uncertain. That's when I knew it was over. Not for them. For me. I stepped down as president that spring. No speech. No announcement. I just submitted a letter, effective immediately, and left the paperwork on the desk. The next day, I walked Buddy through the neighborhood one last time. The air smelled like rain. The maple trees swayed above us, leaves whispering softly. He trotted beside me, tail wagging, oblivious to the ghosts we were walking past. All the memories of battles fought, won, and lost. When we reached the edge of the trail, I looked back at the rows of identical houses, perfect lawns, perfect driveways, perfect silence. It looked just like it did when I'd first arrived. Only this time, I knew better. Later that week, I heard the HOA had appointed a new president, someone eager to restore order. I didn't bother to learn their name. I just hoped they'd do better than I did, because in the end, Carolyn was right about one thing. Rules can always be rewritten, but people rarely change as easily. Months later, long after I'd stopped checking community emails, I drove past Maplewood Estates again. The sign at the entrance looked freshly painted, the lawns perfectly trimmed, and there, in the front yard of Carolyn's old house, I saw the new family again. The dog, the big, happy one, was playing fetch with the kids. No leash, no fear. A for sale sign still leaned against a mailbox nearby, waiting for the next dreamer to move in. And I wondered what kind of story they'd write here, whether they'd find the peace I'd once looked for. As I drove away, Buddy leaned his head out the window, the wind rippling through his fur. For the first time in a long while, I smiled. Not because I'd won, but because I'd finally stopped fighting. Some battles aren't meant to be won. They're meant to teach you what winning really costs. And, in my case, it had cost me everything I thought I hated, until I became it. Thanks for watching and subscribe for more.